When we're asked to find the domain of a function, the domain means all the possible x values. In other words, another way to think about this are what are the restrictions on x? And what does it mean to have a restriction on x? It means what number of x does not make sense for this function. So let's look at the first one. We have y equals the square root of x plus 2. So what number, are there any restrictions here? Are there any numbers that you cannot put under the radical and make sense? So think about numbers that don't make sense under there. You could put a 0 under there. You would have the square root of 0, and that would be 0, and that would make sense. You could put a 2 under there, and you would have the square root of 2, which is the square root of 2. That's the easiest way to write it. But it still makes sense, although it's irrational. You could have the square root of 4, and that would be 2. You could have the square root of 3, and the easiest way to write that is just to keep it the square root of 3. You could have the square root of 9, and that would be 3. So you could think about all these numbers that you put under the radical, and all of them make sense. You're still in the real numbers. So what number can't you put under there? What if you take a negative number? If you have the square root of, say, -1, does that make sense? Is there a real solution to that? No. If you have a negative number under the radical, then there is no real solution. So how do we find the domain? What we do is we take this number under the radical, or this expression under the radical, which is x, and we say, okay, so x has to be greater than or equal to 0, right? X has to be a positive number. So that's the domain, any number that's positive. There are a lot of different ways to write that, but one way that is pretty common would be using the brackets. So a bracket like this means that 0 is included, and then the comma, so that would be the left limit, and then the right limit would be infinity. So the domain for this one would be 0 to infinity. Anything that's less than 0 would not be in the domain. So for this one, we have x minus 7 under the radical. What numbers would make sense? What if I put 7 there? Then I would have 7 minus 7, and I would have the square root of 0. Does that make sense? Sure. But what if I put 6 minus 7? That would be -1. Does that make sense? No, it does not. So, why is this not erasing? Okay. We take this whole expression, x minus 7, and we know that it has to be greater than or equal to 0. And then we would solve this inequality. So to solve an inequality is just like solving an equation with a couple of exceptions, but we could just add the 7 to each side, and we get x is greater than or equal to 7. So that means the left limit would be 7, and the right limit would be infinity. Let's try another one. Same thing here. This expression here, whatever it is, has to be positive, which means 4x minus 13 is greater than or equal to 0. So we could add 13 to both sides, and we get 4x is greater than or equal to 13. And then we divide each side by 4 to isolate the x, and we get x is greater than or equal to 13 over 4. So to write that, that means 13 over 4 is the left-hand limit, is the smallest number that it could be, and then the biggest number it could be would be infinity. How about this one? Now this one might be trying to trick you because it has a coefficient out in front, but that doesn't really matter. We're focused on the restrictions of x. So we're focused on the stuff under the radical. And we know that the stuff under the radical has to be more than or equal to 0. So we do the same thing. 18 minus x has to be greater than or equal to 0. And then we would subtract 18 from each side. So we have negative x is greater than or equal to negative 18. But we are not interested in negative x, we want to find positive x. So we need to divide each side by negative 1. And remember, when you divide an inequality by a negative number, you have to switch the direction of the sign. So now it's less than or equal to, oh, this should be negative 1 here, not negative x. So we have positive x is less than or equal to 18. What does that mean? That means x has to be less than or equal to 18. So that means 18 is the larger limit, and negative infinity is the left limit. So think about that for a minute. Does that make sense? Could you have, like, I don't know, negative, let's say negative 100. So let's think about that. Put in negative 100. So we would have 18 minus negative 100, which is the same thing as 18 plus 100. So we would have the square root of 118. Does that make sense? Sure, it's positive. So this one's kind of backwards. You can put all kinds of negative numbers in for x, and it makes sense. It doesn't make sense, however, when you have a number that's bigger than 18. So think about that. If we had, say, 18 minus 20, then we would have the square root of negative 2. And that doesn't make sense. There's no real solution to that. So if you ever get an answer that doesn't kind of make sense to you, I want you to think about it and start plugging in numbers. So in this case, it does make sense because we can put in big negative numbers all the way to negative infinity, and the highest number we can put in is 18. Let's look at this one. So again, don't be distracted by stuff like this. We're only concerned with what's underneath the radical, x plus 2. And we know that that number has to be greater than or equal to 0. This one's easy. We just subtract 2 from each side and we get x is greater than or equal to negative 2. That means negative 2 is the smallest it could be, so that's the left limit. And then the right limit would be infinity.